All right, so far we've got over 50 people. So we'll just give it one more minute and start close to 5. All right, I think we're going to get started. So welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Jove. I'm from 350.org. Before we officially dive in, I just want to give some tech info. So we're using Zoom webinar for this call. We've got people joining both by computer and by phone. So during the call, we'll have, for those of you who are joining by computer, we'll have the option to take place in some polls. Those of you on the phone, don't worry about it. For anyone, if you get disconnected at any point, this is going to be shared. The recording will be shared after the call, so you can watch it all with the slides and all the presenters at any time afterward. And at the end of the call, we're going to have a Q&A. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a little button that says Q&A. So if you click that, you can type in your question and we will try to answer as many as we can. So I think that covers it. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Deborah.
Thanks, Emily. And thanks everyone who's joined us via computers and phones. I'm Deborah Rosenstein. I'm the US Trainings Coordinator with 350. And we're very excited that there was so much interest in this tonight. And we're looking forward to a great conversation. For those of you who only recently heard about 350, I was reminded by a colleague of mine that there might be some of you on the phone in that category. We're building a grassroots climate movement through organizing and online campaigns and mass public actions. And we have a relatively small staff working around the world with a network that includes folks in nearly 200 countries. And we engage with the climate crisis in a variety of ways, some of which I'll mention later in the call. 350 is also a fairly young organization, and having come on the scene during the Obama administration, we're learning alongside all of you how we can best meet this current political moment. Everyone on this call we know has great ideas and innovations, and we wanted to bring you all together to hear from the authors of the new Resistance Guide and to have a virtual conversation with each other. So with that in mind, the flow for tonight's call, which Emily mentioned already, is to hear from our guests for about 30 minutes. And then we're going to spend a few minutes filling you in on 350's latest work and the ways you can plug in. And then we're going to open it up for questions and discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guests. Behind the scenes and maybe also visible at some point is Danielle Raskin. She's a fellow at the Center for the Working Poor. She graduated from Occidental College in 2017, this year, where she organized on campus around workers' rights, racial justice, and political corruption. She works closely with Paul Engler and Sophie Lassoff and contributed to the Resistance Guide's content and design. Sophie Lassoff is currently leading research on the impact of popular movements at the INEE Institute. She recently helped develop INEE's newest training on social movement ecology, a framework to help organizations work together to deepen their collective impact. She is also a trainer with Momentum, a program to equip organizers in building mass decentralized social movements. And in her free time, she organizes with If Not Now, a movement of young Jews to end the American Jewish community's support of the occupation. Paul Engler, along with his brother, Mark Engler, wrote This Is an Uprising, which maybe some folks on this call have also read, as well as co-authoring the Resistance Guide with Sophie. This Is an Uprising forms the foundation of the Resistance Guide. And so by way of introducing Paul, I'm going to quote from 350's co-founder, Bill McKibben's foreword to This Is an Uprising. This is some of what Bill wrote. He says, "The Englers, it seems to me, have written what will be the foreseeable future, for the foreseeable future, the standard and definitive manual on how to conceive and organize nonviolent social movements. For those of us living amid the aftershocks of the Trump earthquake, this is perhaps the single most useful book we could have. It's like rummaging through the wreckage after your plane crashes on an Andean mountaintop and finding a guide to wilderness survival." Bill is great with the analogies. He also says the great insight of the work is summed up in the word momentum, in the idea that the world can be transformed and sometimes transformed quickly, not incrementally. This is a crucial idea because many of the challenges we face, climate change being perhaps the ultimate example, simply won't allow for piecemeal solutions delivered over great time. When your ice caps are melting fast, winning very slowly is another word for losing. And then just one more paragraph that I thought was interesting was he says, as society evolves, so will some of the techniques for changing it. Still, I expect that This Is an Uprising will be the welcome companion of organizers across the planet for many years to come. It tells us what we need to know in order to stand up for a working future. You can read it for insight and understanding, but at its heart, it's a cookbook. Until you try out the recipes, you won't really grasp just how powerful it is. So this is my copy of this cookbook, of the newest, of the Resistance Guide. And I turn it over to Danielle and Sophie and Paul to fill us in on that.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Paul Engler, and that was a wonderful introduction. Thank you. I'm really honored to be invited to 350. Even in the early days of 350, Bill McKibben and other leaders in 350 were in dialogue with us about some of these theories. And I really feel that 350 is on the leading edge of like how to build a social movement and really ask that question. And, but first thing I want to do before I go into things is really get a sense of where you're at. And I have two questions that will help orient me. One, who here has read the Resistance Guide? Because we sent it out as a PDF for people to download for free. And we're sending out, we sent out a lot of copies to people who bought the paper copy, but you can distribute it for free to your friends and download it. The second thing is, are you familiar with the Indivisible Guide? Have you read it? Are you familiar with it? Because we're going to talk a little bit about the Indivisible Guide. So if you can just do that poll, that would be very helpful for us to understand. Okay. Thank you. So you ask, who in the hell are these guys? Who is Paul and this crew? And really, we came out of this group called Momentum. And I had been an organizer trained in the old school ways of community organizing when I was a student radical in the 90s. And I was then part of the global justice movement that exploded after the shutdown of the World Trade Organization. And then I went into the labor movement and I learned again how to do hardcore, really technical, what we call structure-based organizing. Then the immigrant rights movement exploded in 2006. Millions of people started marching. And what we were trying to do is, how do we think about these different organizing traditions? How do we also learn how to give the best tools of these different ways of organizing to everyone we knew? And we met these people that were Serbian revolutionaries that had overthrown their dictators, and they had done these amazing trainings to their movement. 40,000 people went through week-long trainings and really gave us an incredible sense of like how to train people in the basic strategies that I had never experienced. And so we took a lot of that knowledge from other countries and from our own experience, and we brought in a team from Black Lives Matter, from the climate justice movement, from a lot from the immigrant rights movement and the Dreamers. And we formed a team, and then we created what's called Momentum, which is a training institute. And we trained hundreds and hundreds of organizers and activists from many different movements. And we were able to pick some of the best experiences, the best practices of both training and our own experience of what works, and condensed it into a book. And that is what came out as This Is an Uprising. And a lot of what we learned from the Serbians was part of this field called civil resistance, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. But when we produced this book, it exploded, and we didn't expect that. Lots of people said this really clarifies a lot of what we think about what works. Even Bill McKibben said that. It's like, well, this kind of formalized a lot of what's worked in building a movement in 350. But when the Trump election happened and we lost, we realized that lots of people were reaching out to us, lots of local groups, and the book exploded. We sold tens of thousands of copies now. And then we were in this place of really trying to respond to all these people that strategically felt very lost. So the Resistance Guide is an attempt to translate This Is an Uprising to local activists, people that are on the ground, but don't have lots of experience in being trained as an organizer. And the biggest thing from the Resistance Guide and This Is an Uprising is what is called the field of civil resistance. The field of civil resistance is this field that has developed over decades and decades and decades. And it combines a lot of different things, social movement theory, it combines a lot of different sociology and stuff, but it's really primarily the study of how movements overthrow dictators, how they overthrow governments or regimes that are oppressive, how movements actually work to do that. And there's been these amazing studies of taking massive amounts of information and data around what we know about social movements and really understanding what is the basic theory and data about what works and what doesn't. Just like the military has a science of how to study that, civil resistance has kind of created this massive database, this massive science of how social movements work. And we're trying to package that into a little gem, and the most important gem for local leaders, because it's very complex. And to be honest with you, reading a lot of that academic literature is mind-numbingly boring. So the Resistance Guide is the best juice for you. We're giving you the juiciest parts. That is kind of where the Resistance Guide came from. And we launched it about 3 weeks ago, and free of charge to everybody that wants it. And we've heard just this tremendous response from people who weren't coming to our Momentum trainings. Like, a lot of it has been mothers, to be honest with you, moms and other people telling us like, oh, this Resistance Guide is really helpful at orienting me if people are new to activism. And it's an incredible tool for organizers when they say, this is the material that I'm able to give to people just to orient them to the basic strategy of social movements. So I want to take a big breath in and out. Okay, where are we at right now? I'm going to tell a little bit of a story of where we're at. Trump got elected. We're fucked. Things suck. And what I actually have experienced emotionally is not just that my girlfriend and a lot of women in my life who've been victims of sexual predators and rape, feel that there's a perpetrator in office that publicly acknowledges that he does this behavior and now he's the president. Not just that dreamers, people that I know that are undocumented, are scared that their family is going to get deported now because of the changes of policy that Trump has enforced in ICE. And all that emotion, when that happened, came out in my community, and I felt incredibly depressed and anxious. And it was really hard to hold. Everyone was grieving in their own ways, in the climate movement, losing the Paris Accords, and the labor movement losing basic labor rights and the right to do collective bargaining. And right now we're going to fight around whether or not a lot of labor rights that we need for the labor movement to survive are going to survive. But to be honest with you, a lot of what people were feeling was actually only the tip of the iceberg, in that Trump was actually the climax of this whole movement that the Tea Party created. And what the tip of the iceberg and the climax is that we've lost 32 states. We've lost the House, the Senate, and the governorship of 32 states. We've lost the Senate. We've lost the House. We lost the federal government. And now, not only that, but before, even where I come from, Des Moines, Iowa, when the Republicans would take over, a lot of them were mainstream or moderate. They couldn't oppose a really horrible, horrific conservative Republican agenda. Nowadays, there's very little opposition in their party to ram through some of the most horrific stuff in Michigan, in Iowa, in Wisconsin. These Republicans would make Nixon and Ronald Reagan look liberal. And they have tremendous amounts of power to move their agenda. And they've moved the whole country to the right in a lot of ways around a lot of issues. That is what we're dealing with, is a movement that really isn't just that Trump got elected, but they've actually incredibly successful at polarizing America in a way where the agenda is being enacted all over the place in all these different states. But then something absolutely beautiful happened that, to be honest with you, I was not expecting. I study social movements. I'm a statistics guy. And I study all the different ways in which people protest throughout the history of the United States of America. And right after the Trump election, the protest movement, the resistance movement, as it was loosely called, created the biggest protest in American history. The Women's March, 4 million people marched. The immigrant ban, occupations in protest of the immigrant bans at airports was a huge, very decentralized activity, in some places taking over actually and shutting down airports. Tremendous amounts of activity. Not just that, but month after month, we had bodega strike. We had the fights that other people in the resistance movement. There was a whole vibrant ecosystem of people participating in doing lots of different types of resistance to block the Trump agenda. And this has really been successful. Don't let anybody tell you it hasn't, because when you study this stuff as a political scientist, you realize that Trump's approval ratings, the public opinion, the political weather for him to do anything is horrible. And it could actually be really good. He has so many things lined up for him, but because the movement has created all this resistance, it's very hard for Trump to act. We've blocked a lot of things, and we've created a political environment where he hasn't gotten a lot of things that are just expected of a president. Like, for instance, after inauguration, normally there's always a bump in public approval ratings. There was no bump for Trump because of the protests took over the narrative that Trump was an illegitimate president, that Trump was fucking up. All these things, not including the fact that he hasn't been able to do a huge portion of his agenda, he hasn't been able to do because of the resistance movement. So, but right now, when we're thinking about the resistance guide, we realize that we needed first and foremost to tell people to understand that they're winning and the resistance works and the movement works. But right now we're in a movement cycle. And if you look at this slide, it's about the movement cycle that happens in every social movement. When you have this trigger event, you have a honeymoon stage where lots of people get involved, and they get involved in temporary structures. It's like in a crisis or a natural disaster, or, lots of people drop out and start doing things. But then you have a disillusionment. That's natural. It's a natural part of the cycle. And for a lot of people, that's where they are in the movement cycle. And in the disillusionment, people question whether or not the movement is effective or strong, and whether or not the tactics are effective. And so what we've learned is that the movement has to hold hope. And it's not the actual top leader of the movement that needs to hold the hope and maintain hope, but it's all the grassroots activists have to maintain a sense of hope to fight against all the disillusionment that happens internally within the movement, and the media and the enemies who are constantly trying to delegitimize the movement, say it wasn't the movement that did all these victories, the movement isn't important. They're going to throw that narrative. And so in this point of the cycle, you can see that the movement cycle, you can realize even though the momentum is going down and less people are involved than they were in the past, doesn't mean that the movement is failing. It means that we're in this disillusionment phase, but that we can go through other cycles. This cycle can happen again and again. And for all successful movements, they need to go through multiple cycles, multiple movement cycles. And they only do that if they realize that it's a natural part of the movement to go through this cycle of honeymoon, disillusionment, and then learning and reflection. And the Resistance Guide is really about getting you to learning and reflection and realizing and preparing for the next big cycle of honeymoon phase and trigger event and explosion. So I'm going to hand it off to Sophie.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I just want to say before I start that I'm so thrilled to be here. 350, and particularly the fossil fuel divestment movement, is really my original movement home. It was my first movement home. And so there's a real soft spot in my heart for the climate movement. So I'm so excited to be here and to have this conversation with you all, and to continue the conversation even after this call. So one of the reasons that we asked you all on the poll about the Indivisible Guide is that the Indivisible Guide was a really big influence on us to inspire us to write the Resistance Guide. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Indivisible Guide, essentially it was originally a Google Doc that then got created into an entire organization. But originally a Google Doc that these Obama staffers wrote shortly after the election to explain what they thought the emerging resistance really needed to know about what worked the last time that there was a grassroots movement that stopped the president from being able to do everything that he wanted to do. And that movement that they saw in action during the time that they worked for the Obama administration was the Tea Party movement. And they saw firsthand how Republicans and the Republican Party and their base came from virtually no power, almost no public support. There was huge public support for Obama, particularly in his first term, and slowly but surely built a movement that was strong enough to completely shift the politics and make the way for Trump and to take over government, as we've seen in the last decade. And we love the Indivisible Guide. We are so inspired and energized by the actions that the local leadership all over the country, thousands and thousands of chapters have been able to do with the healthcare fight and many other different fights and pressuring Congress to resist. And it's been one of the most successful resistance efforts since the election. But we also know that the real story of the Tea Party isn't just one tactic. It isn't just the one tactic that Indivisible describes of pressuring members of Congress, of constituents showing up to town halls and calling their members of Congress. This is only one piece of the Tea Party movement and what made them successful. They also had massive protests and that captivated media attention. And they massively influenced elections, local and national. So now that we are in the same place with little to no power in government, we have a decision to make. If we're going to follow the business as usual strategy that the Democratic Party has been leading and continue to lose, or are we going to change our strategy? And what we think is the winning strategy is a social movement strategy, what we call a social movement strategy. And this is what the Tea Party used to win. They actually fought against the mainstream Republicans who, at the time when Obama was elected, wanted to become more centrist, to pander more to the middle. But base of the right wing that created the Tea Party movement chose a strategy that said, we're not going to pander to the middle. We're going to actually double down on our strongest supporters and speak directly to the things that they care about and energize them and use that energy to pull the rest of the Republican Party along with us. And they succeeded. And we've seen that aftermath. After Obamacare, Democrats lost the supermajority in the Senate and the House, et cetera, paving the way to the takeover of Trump. And unfortunately, what we talk about in the guide is how the mainstream of the Democratic Party is bought out by Wall Street and unwilling to admit that their strategy of compromise, of pandering to the middle, is failing. And we need to demand better of them. And that's what we really are saying in our writing in the guide, is that we need to demand better of the left, of the Democratic Party, and of the progressive movements, and to tap into what people on our side really care about and are willing to fight for, not just settle for the narrow terms of what is politically possible, quote unquote, because that narrow strategy is no longer working. So this is what the resistance guide ultimately is all about, is about a social movement strategy so that we can win the country back. And what's super important about this is that we have to believe in it, like Paul was saying, we have to believe in it at a deep level, and we have to fight for it because the mainstream is not advocating for it. The mainstream of the left is not advocating for it. And we don't only have to look to the Tea Party to show us that this works. We, all the time, in Momentum and in our studies, look deeply into our own history of the great movements of the US to gain insight into what really wins using this social movement strategy. So if you really look at the history, every single one of our biggest, most important victories and rights and protections that we've won at the national level, there is a powerful social movement behind it. The abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, New Deal reforms like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, the Civil Rights Act, environmental protections, all of these victories happened not because of politicians who suddenly, by their good graces, changed their mind or were able to pass a perfect policy. None of these things happened because of politicians and people in power. They were originally led by social movements. And in fact, many of the politicians that ended up passing these laws originally fought against them, and then reluctantly followed once the social movement was too powerful to risk not supporting that movement. And this is really, really critical to understand because, like Paul said, the media, politicians, even the history books will continue to tell us that change comes from within the system. This is something that I remember hearing from very, very young, that change comes within the system, and to not believe in the power of social movements. And we really think this is a myth, and that we have to insist over and over and over again that this is a myth. And in the guide, we discuss lots of different movements and go into stories about movements that were victorious because everyday people got together and were able to change the climate of the political debate. Sometimes we use the term change the political weather. And were able to change the public debate so much that it forced politicians to take stands on issues that they would have rather avoided. So we have to believe ultimately that the movement has the power, not the politicians. This is the most important thing to remember. And I'll pass it off to Paul to talk a little bit about one of these movements.
And why we say all this is because in this disillusionment place of the movement, in this place where people are going to be challenging the movement, we have to have this sense of hope and belief deeply, and we have to be convincing lots of other people of that counter narrative for people to make sacrifices. It's a huge deal for people to show up to meetings, to make phone calls, to be participating in the resistance movement. So you need the theory of understanding that it's the social movements, not the other crap, that ends up creating power. And we're going to break that apart. And the resistance guide, if you want more details, you can go into the resistance guide, you can go to This Is an Uprising, and there's a lot more detail about how this stuff works. But one of the biggest and most simple examples of this that everyone relates to is same-sex marriage. What most people don't realize is in same-sex marriage, that fight in marriage equality or LGBT equality, basically for a huge portion of the entire history of the country, very few mainstream Democratic or Republican candidates believed in it, supported it at any level. And it was only right when you had 55% of the public start supporting it, and you had this critical mass of all these people supporting the LGBT rights movement, you got a critical mass of people participating in it. All of a sudden, these politicians had a change of heart when it was in their political interest to do it. They had this moral conversion, quote unquote. I don't believe it was a moral conversion. I think what happened, and there's a lot of evidence to this, not just in same-sex marriage, but movement after movement, is when you have the political weather in the right place, politicians will follow. They don't lead. They're not the ones who create the change in the political weather. It's the movement. And in same-sex marriage, it was exactly that. If you look, this is a poll of passive support for the movement. And then once you hit 55, 60% of the American population really supporting it, and you had a lot of people putting pressure on the politicians, boom, everything changed. All these pillars, all these politicians that were holding up the status quo started falling, and everything changed. So then we have to ask, okay, if that's the case, if you change the political weather enough, politicians will follow. The next question is, well, how do social movements work? How do social movements actually do this? And one of the things we talk about again and again in the research of social movements, there's this woman called Erica Chenoweth. She's a professor in Colorado, and she created this giant database of almost every single movement in the last 100 years that has overthrown a colonial government or a regime, or has overthrown a dictator. And she created this giant database of what tactics they used, how many people participated, different campaigns. It's this amazing database. And what she saw in the fundamental deepest pattern, one of the deepest patterns in who was successful and who was not, was sustained participation, the amount of people actually participating in the movement. And she said that some really amazing things. She said, in my data set of all these movements, almost every single movement that I could find that fits this category, no movement has ever failed if 3.5% of the population participated and had sustained participation. And we see lots of movements that won with much less. Maybe they won with 1.5% of the population. Maybe they won with 2%. But if you get to that critical mass of 3.5, not one regime was able to maintain their sense of power, maintain the power of the government if 3.5 participated. And in my book, when we studied all these social movements, we realized that the critical element of whether or not a movement works or is able to change the weather or pull the public towards them has to do with the amount of people that are in sustained participation. That's the thing that is the cornerstone or the foundation of whether or not a movement is able to win. Go ahead, Sophie.
So if sustained participation is the golden key to winning, then how do we get as many people as possible to our side? The way that we move people to become active, what we call active supporters, and become part of the movement is by moving them along what we call the spectrum of support, which for those of you on the computer can see on this slide. You've got the opposition on one end and the movement on the other. And then you've got active supporters and opponents, passive supporters, passive opponents, and those neutral who haven't made up their mind on the issue yet. So people who already agree with us, who already agree that climate change exists and that it's a problem, or that Trump is a psychomaniac and we need to get him out of office, or any number of issues, people who already agree with us, we motivate them to act on it, to not just agree in thought, but to act on it. And we get more and more people to act so powerfully that the people who are neutral feel drawn to our side of the story and away from supporting the opposition. So we're actually not focused on winning over the opposition, on changing their minds. We're focused on moving more people in the public to our side and making the opposition look and feel small and isolated and against the tide of history that is sweeping towards our side of the story. So this is what we call polarization. And it's called polarization because it really is like a magnet with these two opposite poles, these two opposite sides. And what a movement does, what powerful protest does, is it makes people so active, it makes the movement so magnetic that it pulls more and more people to our side. So how do we do this? We talk a lot more in depth about this in the guide and in This Is an Uprising. And polarization and the science and the art of movement building is extremely complex, and there's lots and lots of tools and concepts that you can use to understand it. But we just wanted to give you one gem, one little snippet of something that's really fundamental and important to making polarization work and to moving people into a movement. And one of these key concepts is that protest forces people to pick a side. You might even have heard that before. Whose side are you on? And what this means is that protest is so good at dramatizing injustice, at making visible something that was otherwise ignored, making visible what's really at stake, what sort of moral issue is at stake, that those in power would previously rather just ignore. So through powerful protest again and again, this is why we use the word sustained participation, because it has to happen over and over again. Movements like the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement is a great example. It really, through these powerful actions, through over a decade, shone like a floodlight, a spotlight on the injustice that didn't just appear all of a sudden then during the time of the Civil Rights Movement. That injustice had been taking place for many, many decades. People of color in the South had been brutalized by and dehumanized by Jim Crow and segregation for generations. But what the Civil Rights Movement did through the power of protest was expose that inhumanity to the people in the public who were ignoring it, and brought the national conversation to such a boiling point that it forced the public and the people in power to actually contend with that reality. And many, many, many people were compelled through that power of that protest to no longer be neutral. But these kinds of actions, they don't move people all at once, right? We're not gonna succeed because we create the best whose side are you on perfectly crafted message and it's gonna cause a light bulb moment across the country. That will start it, But people moving across the spectrum, if you can go back to the spectrum, people moving across the spectrum requires us participating and acting powerfully over and over and over through many cycles until we win more support than the opposition. So from our research and experience, we boiled it down to 3 essential strategies in the resistance guide that we think make a successful movement. And so what we're doing here is also just naming what already exists in the resistance ecosystem that is currently been emerging over the last year in the many organizations and activities that make up this ecosystem and make up the progressive movements that we're all part of. So it's naming these is just about understanding their value and also recognizing that they're strongest when working together. So the 3 types of resistance that we talk about are game change, outside game, and inside game. So first, game change is activated by what we call trigger events. So these events, these massive public moments where tens of thousands of people flood into the streets, you can sort of bring yourself back to a trigger event moment that you may have been part of when tens of thousands of people flood into the streets. People are coming out of the woodwork to protest, to post, to speak out and galvanize around an issue. And this is when the biggest numbers are involved. This is why we call it mass movements, because people are acting en masse and the most new people come in. This is the best at recruiting new energy. So examples of this is Women's March and airport protests. These are great examples of game change. The outside game is when all those thousands of people that are recruited by these game change moments, people who are newly activated into the resistance, flood established organizations and use their power either as workers or students, and most importantly, as constituents to elected officials to hold decision makers accountable and pressure them to act. So pressuring members of Congress to resist Trump's every move. This is outside game strategy. So indivisible is where this strategy sits within this strategy. And then the last one is the inside game. So the inside game is when we use the power of elections and the platform of elections and the positions of politicians to put movement leaders in charge, people who actually align with the values of the movement. So if you think about the energy and the numbers and also the uncompromising attitude that fills the streets through game change and outside game, if we turn this on electoral politics, then we can actually challenge mainstream or corporate Democrats to either represent the movement or be replaced. So the Bernie campaign is a really great example of this.
So we're not going to be able to explain all the intricacies of these 3 types of resistance. But the reason we're explaining the 3 types of resistance and all these concepts, even if it seems like they're pretty simple or you agree with them, is that what we realized is people need to know these concepts so well, and they need to know them in a way that they can convince other people of these concepts, of this basic framework. Right now, in a successful movement ecology that's happening right now in the resistance movement, you have game change people, you have inside game people, and you have outside game people. You have people like 350 that primarily do game change. They're creating a social movement that's changing the political weather around climate change. But they also do some outside game. They do some pressure on policy decisions and stuff, and they do a little bit of the inside game. Most organizations, though, generally fit within, like Black Lives Matter generally fits within game change. Different organizations fit within different places. And what we have to realize, instead of criticizing everybody, we have to realize that these 3 strategies are actually complementary. They actually provide for each other. We need all 3. And when you have a movement with all 3, it is an amazing, explosive, powerful concoction, just like the Tea Party did. The Tea Party had protests that recruited people, that got the spotlight, that got them on the front pages of of conservative papers and the New York Times and Fox News pumped that up, and that recruited people and changed the public dialogue. And they funneled those into organizations that put pressure on the Republicans, put pressure on Democrats over phones and in town hall meetings. And then they used that pressure and that movement on the outside game when it came to elections to force Republicans who did not represent the movement and the values of the movement out. And all three of those worked really well together to build an effective movement. We need those, and we need people to realize and appreciate the successes of each one and know that participating in each piece at a minimal level is very good for our movement. We need to cultivate that complementary strategy and participation at a minimal level at each three. While most people are going to focus most of their time in an organization that might be only in one section. And we get into this a lot more in the resistance guide if you're interested in the complexity of what that looks like, what it looks like to act strategically within one type of resistance and have a minimal level of commitment.
Great. Thank you all so much. We want to get to the questions. I've seen some people already asking some. I'm just very quickly, and Danielle, we can go to the next one, going to talk about ways, and we can go to the next one, that people can get involved in local organizing very much as part of, we'll let Sophie and Paul tell us what category we're in, but crossing over with those. So game chain sounds good to me. So if you are near a local group, perhaps you know that already, and perhaps you don't. So we have a lovely map here that helps you find out where local 350 groups are. And we hope, if you're not involved already, that you'll check that out and go to that map through the link that's there on the screen. 350 local groups, I'm kind of new on staff, and I've been very pleasantly surprised to learn that 350 local groups are this wonderful mix of autonomous and also getting a lot of support from the national. So we can go to the next slide. And we want you to know that if you don't live near a local 350 group, that there's going to be an exploratory call on the 1st of November to learn more about that. No commitment needed, it's exploratory. So if you're interested in finding out about that, registering, we've got the information up on the screen. For those of you who are calling in and listening, you just email Michelle, spelled the usual way, at 350.org, and she'll let you know about that. And so if we go to the next slide, the other ways to plug in with 350, there's a lot of amazing campaigns that we have going on. Emily can say a few words about our Keep It in the Ground work.
Yeah, I'll keep it really quick. One of the big campaigns we have going right now that's going to really be ramping up this fall is the Keystone XL pipeline campaign. So we are expecting a decision sometime in November. The Nebraska Public Service Commission will vote on the final permit. So depending on what that happens, there could be a moment for a big mobilization. So stay tuned for more updates on that. And as we know, Keystone is just one example of the fossil fuel infrastructure that we are fighting. And we have compiled a map of all the places that are fighting fossil fuel pipelines, terminals, oil trains, every kind of fossil fuel project. So you can go to fossilfuelresistance.org and find a group that's fighting a project near you and join in as well.
Great. So we're also, Sophie mentioned fossil free as an entry point for her with the movement. We're launching a distributed campaign to pass fossil fuel resolutions in cities, counties, and states across the country. There's a lot of exciting stuff to learn about that. But again, so we can get to questions on this call, I'll just say that we're going to be having events in mid-November to get in on the action and to look more from us in the next week, actually, about that. People on this call might have heard about our Children's Trust. This is young people from across the US who are suing the US government in a historic lawsuit. It's game-changing, I would say, in that category, youth-driven, pretty wonderful stuff and ways for people to plug in around a call to action, probably in the first half of 2018. And then Mazaska Talks is right around the corner in terms of a global day of action. So Mazaska is Lakota for money. This is an indigenous-led, amazing global campaign. So from October 23rd to October 25th, 92 of the world's largest banks are actually going to be meeting in Sao Paulo. And so this is a campaign to get all of them, as many as possible, to divest and to have mass global action, pushing them around climate disaster and the abuse of indigenous peoples specifically. So if you can check out those URLs that are on the screen. And if you're listening on the phone, what we're going to do is we're going to send you these slides at the end of this. And so you will be able to get these URLs because I know you can't see them. So without further ado, we're going to do questions from folks on this call. And there's also resources, right? There's resources at the very end. People have been, it's a very good question, have been putting in the question thing here on Zoom, where do I get the resistance guide? So folks can download it as well as getting a hard copy. And do you guys want to say anything more about that? Guess?
Yeah, you can go to guidingtheresistance.org. Is that right, Sophie?
Yep, that's right. I just put it in the chat as well.
So guidingtheresistance.org, and you can download it for free, PDF, or you can order a print copy. We print it at cost, basically. So, and we'll send you a signed copy.
Great. So one of our first questions that came in is, what concrete actions can we take to move people across the spectrum that you all showed us so lovely in your slide?
So there's two, okay, so in civil resistance, Gene Sharp has this large list. It's, you know, some people say it's 197 tactics. There's some people say it's like 250, whatever. There's tons of protest tactics that 350 is using, lots of organizations are using. What we have to know is that protest actually does work. Like people, oh, it doesn't work. Who cares? It's just preaching to the choir. But actually, that's how people get the microphone. That's how we get the spotlight, even in a small world, even on social media. When I do something, my small group is influenced by that. But the two major things that we emphasize too is, one is trigger events that happen in the public, like Charlottesville, the massacre that happened in Charlottesville. And then there were all these vigils and protest response to that. And they pop up all over the place around that. Or 350 did a huge march after the Trump rejected the Paris Accords. So there's these events that happen that create trigger events, or protests that happen that create trigger events where lots of people are participating, and actually showing up in a small way to some of those protests is bang for your buck. It really helps elevate the narrative and get the story out around that trigger event that is polarizing the public. The second thing is what we call small actions that are really designed to sustain participation. So those are actions that really 350 is sort of talking about that you would do in your local groups. It's like calling people. It might be doing like a banner drop. It might be doing leafletting or flyering. It might be doing little vigils. You know, these things, they don't have a big impact on the media, but they keep people involved, and they keep the active base of people that know you involved. And they're really, both of them are targeted at the public. They're targeted at keeping people involved and polarizing the public.
It's great. I just want to highlight what Kim said, that trigger events are also a good chance to network and meet like-minded people. Totally. Yeah. So a question from Laura is, how are folks using the social media tools in a non-traditional way? I don't know if that was meant for 350 or in relation to what you all were talking about.
Well, I'll just say this real quick. People call all these new revolutions, whenever they pop up, they call them, this is the internet. This is they call the Egyptian, uprising. This is the Facebook revolution. And my experience talking to Egyptians that were part of that uprising, or the Serbians or whatever, is that technology is only a small part of it. and it helps, but it doesn't change basically the basic equation of how you do organizing. But I will say it is helpful for a variety of reasons, for two things. One, for polarizing and targeting the public, it helps to have social media to use that basically as a form of alternative media. We don't have to have access to the mainstream media as much because we can publicize protests and actions. The second thing is that 350 is a non-traditional organization in a lot of ways, because in the 80s, it would be very hard for social movements to be funded if they're going to do things that are polarizing or controversial and create trigger events, because they couldn't raise the money through mainstream foundations. Nowadays, social movements have a much greater capacity to raise small donations to do dramatic protests. And that has changed the equation. That's one of the reasons, one of 20 reasons why we have more outbreaks of protests now, is because social media allows us to raise more money to do disruptive and polarizing and very effective protest on the right and on the left. Great.
So earlier, back when you all were talking about the Tea Party, someone raised the question of that the Tea Party depended on lies and creating doubt. And so just wondering, since that's not where folks are coming from on the left, if that at all influences your analysis of that. And maybe it doesn't. That was a question.
You want to take this, Sophie?
Yeah, I could take a stab at that one. So I agree. First off, I'll say that we're in no way endorsing the Tea Party. We think that they were very smart and very strategic about how they were able to build what we described as our social movement strategy and electoral campaign to really change the politics of this country, and that was very, very successful, as we've seen. So what we are really interested in doing is studying them for those reasons, to see what worked about their strategy. What I would also say is that the right and what we've seen with Trump is that the right, when it's taking what some people call like a populist approach, one that is more geared towards popular opinion or towards sort of the people against the establishment, that the right populism tends to use this attitude of divide and conquer. So in order to delegitimize the establishment and to gain power on the populist right, they divide people up by race, by ethnicity, by class, by sexual orientation, by all of these different ways that people can be easily manipulated to be pitted against one another. And you see that in history with right populist leaders and right populist movements, and I would consider Trump a right populist leader, all the time, that they use this strategy of dividing people and like you said, like sowing sort of doubt and lies about who people are because of the color of their skin, et cetera, et cetera. But what left populism is able to do, if we can, is unite people under a much broader we. Who is the we who can actually who actually wants to build America to sort of fulfill what it should be, what its promise was, which is to be for all people. An America for all people. And that left populism still has the angle of, who's us versus the establishment. The establishment is doing us wrong. They're in power for the wrong reasons and are corrupted. But that the we is much bigger and focuses on actually uniting people across those divisions. And that's kind of the challenge that I think is in front of us, that we have a huge opportunity to do. Is unite people across the divisions that Trump and other people on the right are trying to make more divided.
Great. So we need to use the populist strategy and the social movement strategy that has worked on the left and on the right, but how we do it is going to be different than the right.
Great. So if it's cool with our panelists and with other folks, we're going to just go 5 minutes over here because there's two really good questions that just came in that are, one is connected to what we were just talking about. Someone was asking in terms of polarizing, and you just spoke to this, I think, Sophie, in terms of bringing everyone together, but saying that in a way isn't even thinking about polarizing as a strategy for us, a way of reinforcing us versus them. And so rather than do things that we know for sure might upset, quote, the other side shouldn't, and might encourage them to lash out, might we want to stay away from that? So just if you guys can talk a little bit more about the polarizing strategy vis-a-vis the unifying strategy.
Well, first thing is that people always, in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King was not popular. I mean, he wasn't popular until he died, really. People don't like social movement tactics, but that doesn't mean that we're not winning them over on the issue. And the question about polarization, we need to polarize. I believe in polarization, but the question is, are we polarizing the public and a majority of the public towards our issue, or are we pushing them away? Because there is tactics and there is things that we can do that isolate us from the rest of the public. But we actually believe in polarization. We just need the right type of polarization. We need popular polarization. We can't actually move people and sustain people in their hearts with tons of energy by pretending that we all agree and we could be in great dialogue and everything. No, we have to fire up the troops. We have to really believe in our arguments, and we have to call out the injustice, not necessarily towards each other, but against the establishment, and unify, as Sophie was saying, a populist strategy that unifies the American public towards our side. But it is going to polarize. It is going to create conflict with our opposition.
And I would just add that if you study social movements, when the public is really polarized around an issue, the opposition does lash out. The opposition gets really upset, right? And that's why I said that thing about that we're not actually designing our actions and our protests and our powerful messages to target the opposition, to try to change their minds. The opposition is always going to get upset that we're moving people to our side and that we're actually demonstrating the problem. And you see this in movements all the time. After the immigrant rights movement really exploded in the beginning of the millennium, the Minutemen, this sort of really terrible militia at the border popped up in response to the power of the immigrant rights movement in a way that we had never seen, in sort of the southern states of our country along the border. That was really, that opposition was really fired up in response to the popularity and the power of the immigrant rights movement. But the key there was that the movement was so strong and was able to captivate the public enough that the Minutemen looked like small and extremists, and the movement looked popular and sort of riding the tide of history and pushing the country in a better direction. So it's not that the opposition will cease to exist or that it won't lash out against the movement. The opposition will continue to exist and will respond, and will maybe respond powerfully. But as long as we can move more people to our side, then that's okay, because they're going to get smaller and more isolated the more we can move people to our side.
Great, thanks. And another question that I think we can end with this one is around, someone wrote and said, our citizens' highest priority issues are affordable and equitable housing, transportation, immigration, public safety, health. How important is it for the climate movement to address these issues as we grow our movement? I'm thinking that's what was at the very end there. I was just gonna take that and say that at 350, we're doing our best to connect the dots between these things. So I think it's an excellent question. And everything that was listed, there's actually overlay with immigration and climate, with transportation and climate. So, the word intersectional can sometimes be overused these days, but I think it's really important. And so if we go back to maybe the slides real quickly, if you can help us with that, Danielle, I just wanted to mention that on our resource link there with 350, We have lots of trainings and skill ups and actually things that speak to this question. And we would love, really love it if folks who are asking these questions who are on the call tonight can interact with us on those forums and help us to improve them and engage with them, because we're trying to spark this conversation in a broader way. And just super grateful for Paul and Sophie and Danielle for being here with us. I heard there's even more questions that are coming in on YouTube Live. In order to respect everyone's time, we're going to end it here, but we really hope we can continue that. Folks can be in touch with the authors of the Resistance Guide, can be in touch with us at 350, and we're gonna keep building. So do you guys have any last comments before we close?
Well, I will say is that when any single issue movement is stronger and fighting against the establishment, we're all stronger. You know, we're all stronger. It builds the resistance. Any part of the resistance movement that is stronger helps us all.
Amen. Anything else? Emily, anything we should know about technology as we're hanging up?
Nope. I just want to say that I will send the recording to everyone who registered. And I will also paste the slides right here, so you can take a look at the slides. And yeah, we'll be in touch with you soon.
Great.
And I would just say that please download the guide. It's free for a reason, because we just want as many people as possible to have it. So download it. Even if you don't read it, share it with someone who you think might. That's really why we offered it for free. And you can buy the pretty version in hard copy, but just download it for free and have it in your back pocket if you ever need it.
And send it out over your list. You know, if you have lists of friends or on Facebook, you want to share it on social media, feel free to do that.
That's great. And thanks for Molly for writing that the guide was much more forceful presented in this way than reading it individually. We agree. So
better together.
Great.
Thanks all. Bye.